a little bit of research around the relationship of B vitamins with exercise. Right? B vitamins work as a complex, so there's quite a few B vitamins and they work together as a complex. So that means that if I'm deficient in one, it can affect how well I can use the others, right? Because they work as a team. So they play an essential role in energy production, right? So then that would suggest that if I'm low in B vitamins, that I'm gonna feel tired, I might not have the energy to train very hard, right? B12 is required to produce red blood cells, so if I'm low in B12, I may be anemic, right? B1 is used within the memory, within the hippocampus and for memory. So if I'm low in B1, I'm not going to do too well in class, right? When we look at the effects on energy production, right, then we see increased carbohydrate metabolism with B vitamins and a decrease in blood lactate levels, which means that we're using less glycolysis and more aerobic work. However, even though we have that finding, it doesn't seem to translate into improved performance, right? So it's a little bit odd that we see better use of carbs if we have B vitamins available, and yet that better use of carbs doesn't seem to translate to an improved performance, right? So we don't see an increase in aerobic or anaerobic or maximal strength power performances, right? It may aid overall health, probably does. If I have a deficiency, then probably will need to take a supplement. Doctors often will give you a tonic for B vitamins, right? That I can take that will help me feel less tired. But you shouldn't really take a lot of B vitamins if you don't have a deficiency, all right? Overall, when we look at the literature on vitamins, if there's a deficiency, then supplementing them may be beneficial to performance, particularly vitamin C, vitamin Bs. But if your diet is adequate and you have a healthy balance across carbs and fats and proteins, and you're eating some fresh fruits and vegetables, then you shouldn't really need to supplement, all right? And taking megadoses, so there was a trend a while back where people thought that, you know, if a little bit helps, then I should take a lot and it would help even more. There's no support in the research for megadosing on vitamins, all right? And remember that those fat-soluble ones can even reach toxic levels if I'm taking too many of them, all right? So then our other micronutrients are minerals. Minerals are inorganic, so they don't have they're not based on carbon like our organic foods. There's 22, they make up about 4% of your body mass on average. So, you know, I've got, obviously my bones have a lot of minerals in them. They're involved in chemical reactions, for muscle contraction, for nerve impulse transmission, protein synthesis, maintenance of fluids in the right parts of the body, in the right tissues. So they do a lot of jobs for us. Again, they get split into two subgroups. We have macro minerals, where we've got somewhere between 35 and roughly 1,000 grams in our bodies. So sodium, potassium, calcium are macro minerals, all right? And then we have micro minerals, where they're also sometimes called trace minerals. We only have a little bit, tiny little bit of those in the body. Iron, zinc, chromium, right, are all micro minerals. And again, the recommendation is that you should not supplement above the recommended amounts, that there's no literature to show that taking more of any of these improves performance, unless we were deficient in them in the first place, all right? So we'll look at a couple of them that have more of an impact on performance. And just to let you know, there's a couple of really good tables in the textbook that give you where you can find them, what are the symptoms of being deficient in them, and what do they do, all right? So there's a couple of really nice tables to help you out there. All right, so iron is part of many different proteins and enzymes. We've talked specifically about the fact that it is part of hemoglobin, and that hemoglobin cannot do its job transporting oxygen properly if the iron is low, right? So it plays this kind of major role in oxygen transport and therefore in metabolism. Most iron is found within the hemoglobin and the myoglobin, all right? So those two substances, the hemoglobin is in the blood transporting oxygen, the myoglobin is in the muscle tissue facilitating oxygen moving across the cell to the mitochondria, right? That's where we find the majority of it. You also find some in substances that are in the liver and the spleen and in the bone marrow. Right? So it's the most common deficiency. Everybody's heard of anemia. Some of you may have had anemia. We talked a little bit about that previously, that we can have this kind of fake anemia that can occur with athletes because of the increase in plasma volume versus the increase in red blood cells, right? So iron deficient anemia, true anemia, will benefit from taking an iron supplement. The sport anemia version, the athlete version, isn't gonna, because it isn't really anemia, obviously does not benefit from any supplementation, okay? If you're vegetarian, then you've got to be careful about how do I find sources of iron that I'm going to have in my diet, right? Or vegan. Iron absorption is improved in the presence of vitamin C. So you want to, if you're going to have to supplement it, then you need to make sure that you supplement it. Maybe take your supplement with some orange juice or something like that, so that you've got the vitamin C available, because again, there's no point in having iron in your digestive tract if it's not being absorbed into the body and used for the jobs, right? Just eating it isn't always enough. You've got to make sure it's absorbed, okay? So, calcium's the one we have the most of. We need it for muscle contraction. Remember, it's stored in the sarcoplasmic reticulum. It's released when the sarcoplasmic reticulum is stimulated, and the calcium attaches to which protein? Oh, well done. Tropomyosin. Okay, so the actin. And then we see a shift in the actin protein and we get sliding filament theory. All right, so we've got a lot of calcium within our muscles. Obviously, we have tons of calcium in our bones. Right? It's necessary then for contraction, not just of my skeletal muscle, but my heart as well. And for typical normal tooth development in children, we need calcium. So in areas of the world where the children don't get enough milk, for example, then we see poor tooth development and tooth decay. But about 99% of the calcium in the body is in the bones. So, come back to that osteopenia, osteoporosis idea. If I don't take in enough calcium in my diet, because I need calcium for muscle contraction, and that is prioritized over bone health, then the body will leach calcium from the bones to supply calcium to the heart and the skeletal muscles, if necessary. Okay? So then that puts the bones at risk of developing osteopenia, which is grade 1, and then osteoporosis is the more severe version of bone mineral disorder. Okay. So for women in particular after menopause, because in females, laying down calcium in the bones is connected to the level of estrogen. When you go through menopause and your estrogen levels drop, then it becomes harder to lay down calcium and you become at more risk of developing bone mineral disorders. So oftentimes you'll get a recommendation from your nurse doctor to take a calcium supplement. If you take a calcium supplement, you have to have a calcium supplement that has D3. All right, so always look for a calcium supplement that says it includes D3, because otherwise the calcium can't be absorbed. All right. All these fun things we get to know. All right, and then the last little bit of information in the nutrition chapter is looking at what we should eat around our competitions. So whether it's a meet, whether it's a game, right? So it's very similar to the information that we looked at about how we supplement training. You know, when should I take protein? When should I take carbohydrate? It's just a little more cautious, I think, the recommendations when we're looking at competition. Right? So before a competition, generally 2 to 3 hours out. If it's too close, then if it's within half an hour of your competition, you're going to get a drop in blood glucose because of that insulin kick from the food. You don't want that, so you really don't want to eat too close unless it's like 5 minutes beforehand. And then you don't get such a big insulin kick because that glucose gets used for energy straight away. again, it's very individual. Not everybody indicates a drop in blood glucose if they eat half an hour. So for some people that's great, but that's not the general recommendation. Okay. Let me see. So the goal before the competition is that the athlete doesn't get hungry while they're competing. All right? And they don't want a lot of undigested food left in their stomach, because that's uncomfortable when you're competing, right? Especially if you get nervous as well. So, many resources will recommend that you use a liquid food before a competition. Again, I think particularly if you have an athlete who gets very nervous, a liquid might do better than something solid for them. It needs to be low in fat and fiber because we don't want to delay gastric emptying. We want to move that carbohydrate out and into the cellular level as quickly as we can. And we don't want a lot of fiber that then causes gastrointestinal stress. Right? We don't want someone having gas and tummy cramping and things when they're trying to compete. Right? So somewhere between 200 to 300 grams of carbohydrate, again, depending upon the size of the person, the type of exercise they're going to do. Okay? And something that's easy to digest, say it could be liquids, particularly if it's going to be very close to the competition time. If you're prone to nausea, then liquids, as I said, might be better. If you have multiple events, right? So if you're a sprinter or a thrower or a jumper, and you're going to run, the first race is round 1, and you make the top 2, so you get to the next round. But you have to wait an hour before the next round, and then you run it, right? Then a liquid carbohydrate can be more beneficial possibly than having something solid that wouldn't have time to digest, okay? And the big point, which seems so obvious, and yet people kind of get, you know, maybe a friend on another team has a really cool new drink or a new carbohydrate, you know, bar of some kind, and they're like, oh, try this, it's brilliant. And you, like, don't try anything new on the day of a competition. Stick to what you know, take the bar home, try it another day, right? Because you don't want to risk having something that upsets you when you've got to compete at a high level. Yeah.
How do you get 200 to 300 grams of carbohydrates in
Because they add glucose or
like what would it be? It's like drain?
yeah, I mean, I still think, I go back to our chocolate milk idea is a good, although you would want a low fat one before a competition, not a whole fat. But in a carbohydrate drink, you're looking at a ratio, you want the ratio to be right. They ought to be able to tell you how much carb is in one serving of the drink. But the carbs will be glucose or fructose or galactose. I think if you eat, again, it depends on the person, if you can eat 2 hours out from the competition and not get hungry at the competition, so if you have some oatmeal and some peanut butter or, you know, have oatmeal, banana, peanut butter 2 hours ahead of the competition, then you can eat that solid food, measure out your amounts, and see what works for you. But if you're someone who eats 2 hours out and then half an hour before the competition your stomach is falling through the floor, then obviously you've got a slightly different situation. And it's so individual. That's why I think a really good sport nutritionist is a huge benefit if you can access someone who really understands sport nutrition, because and then again keep those diaries, because how you respond is going to be completely different to how your teammate responds. So the goal is to have enough circulating glucose to get going with your energy production quickly, right? But not so much food that you feel heavy or uncomfortable or you're cramping. After the competition, depends a little bit upon the timeline that you're having to work with. Typically, the food that you're going to eat post-competition, the goal is to recover glycogen stores as quickly as possible, right? So if you've got to do that very quickly because you've got to compete again later in the day, or you have to compete immediately again the following day, then the recommendation 0.4 grams per kilogram of body mass every 15 minutes. Very boring, I would think. Right? For 4 hours, every quarter of an hour for 4 hours, you're supposed to eat some carbs. Right? If you don't have to recover that quickly because you've got a couple of days until the next training or competition, then remember our 2-hour window. We want to get a carb-protein mix in within that 2-hour window, and you want to try to keep eating some carb at intervals for about 6 hours. Carb and protein mix after the competition, because we want to also stimulate protein synthesis within the muscle. Right? And we need the carbohydrate to stimulate the protein synthesis, and the protein stimulates carbohydrate synthesis. And we want to make sure that there's plenty of amino acids available to start fixing the damage that we did with the competition. Right? So the competition meals are very similar to the information around the training, recovery, and gaining muscle mass, just a little more careful, because you want to, you know, the recovery, the post-competition needs to make sure that you're ready for the next day's competition if you have that. The pre-competition, it's important to make sure that you don't give yourself gas, cramping, anything like that, and that you've got enough energy to compete. Try and get all the way back to the beginning. Da, da, da. Okay, so my goal with chapter 13, wrong number, chapter 13. writing training programs for individuals, okay? So we can write programs from a health perspective, we can write programs from a competitive perspective, okay? The first part of the chapter looks at cardiovascular disease and the benefit of particularly aerobic work on your risk factors for cardiovascular disease. So we're going to look at that first. And then we'll start looking at the prescription idea, and we're going to build a FIT matrix. All right, so FIT is frequency, intensity, time, type. And we're going to build a little matrix out of the information from the chapter and from the ACSM. There is an ACSM document up on Blackboard. I highly recommend you pull that off because it's great, okay? If you can't see it, remind me to open it, but I think it's open, okay?
Read the reading?
Yes. Because apparently I forgot to open 2 things this week already, so I can't guarantee that anything's working on Blackboard right now, because my brain is a little scattered. So our objectives for this chapter: be able to understand the different types of cardiovascular disease, look at the risk factors for coronary artery disease. We talked about medical clearance in labs, so I might scoot over that bit pretty quickly. How do we apply the guidelines for aerobic and resistance and flexibility training to health? And then at the end, we'll start looking at what's the more competitive approach? What about periodization? What about overtraining, undertraining? And we'll look at some of those concepts, all right? So, the difference between fitness and health. This is a little bit similar to the conversation about when do I use the word exercise and when do I say physical activity, all right? Because exercise has a very negative connotation for many typical individuals. All right, it means they have to go to the gym, they have to do something they don't want to do, it's going to hurt, it's going to take time, right? All these things are wrapped up with that one little word. So then we want to use physical activity. But we want to understand the difference between fitness, right, which is the adaptation you're looking for when you're training in order to improve your performance at an event. Whether you're competing or not competing is secondary, right? I might not compete anymore, doesn't mean I don't want to improve my performance at something, all right? So then we're looking at getting fitter, okay? But a lot of people don't want that, right? But a lot of people, in my view everyone, should be interested in being more healthy, right? And health benefits are adaptations that we see with our physical activity that reduce the risk of disease, right? So a health benefit is aimed at reducing risk, and a fitness benefit is aimed at improving performance. So if you're going to write a program for someone, the first thing you have to do is identify what is it they want, right? Are they looking to get more healthy, or do they want to get fit? All right? and use the right verbiage based upon what the individual's goals are. Right? So we've already looked at intensity in lab. We did that lab lecture way back. All right? So intensity, remember, is looking at how hard am I working? What is the work rate for this piece of activity? And volume is how much am I doing? All right? So health benefits, I don't need that person to work as hard or as much as someone who is looking for fitness benefits. Okay? And when we get to the end of this piece of information, we'll talk about the fact that actually fitness training can lead to some negative consequences because we can do too much of it. Right? So deaths from cardiovascular disease have actually gone down since the 70s, which is great. However, we're still looking at about 71 million adults in the US have cardiovascular disease at one level or another, and about 1 million of that 71 million will die from their cardiovascular disease. So though all of the numbers have gone down, we're still talking a lot of people who are dying because of something that is often preventable, right? Not always, but often. Okay. So some of the reasons the numbers have gone down is because we see less people smoking now than we did in the 70s. Even though there are still way too many people smoking, it's significantly lower than it was when I was growing up. Right? Everybody had it. It was sexy to have a cigarette in your hand, so everybody had a cigarette. Not me, I never did that. Right? I guess I was never sexy. All right, so nutrition has improved for a large number of people on the planet. All right, again, not everybody. Nutrition has declined for certain populations. But certainly in the US, overall nutrition levels have gone up. Right? We've got way better medical techniques, we've got better diagnoses, so we can pick problems up earlier and intervene with them, and then they don't exacerbate and end up in death. We've got better drug treatments now. So there's lots of factors that play into the idea that the numbers have come down. Okay? So cardiovascular disease is the umbrella term. Under the umbrella, we have coronary artery disease, stroke, high blood pressure, heart failure, all right, also peripheral artery disease. Okay? So many of these things are linked to our lifestyle. So coronary artery disease occurs when there is a blockage of the major left or right coronary artery. So if you remember back to when we did the cardiovascular disease, we've got a major artery wrapping round from one side, one wrapping round from the other side, and then they kind of spread out into all these little capillaries and arterioles. Right? So if we get a partial blockage of an artery, then it reduces the space through which the blood, it restricts blood flow. Right? But if it's a partial blockage, we're still getting some blood flow through. But we're likely to see ischemia, which is kind of death, deterioration of the muscle cells. The key for you guys as movement people is that often people have partial blockages of arteries if they're sedentary and their heart doesn't have to work hard, they never find out. Right? So when you're in the front line of movement teaching, you're going to be the person who stresses their heart, and they're going to find out that they have a blockage. All right? So you have to be very aware of the person that you're working with. Are they playing with their chest? Are they shaking their arm? Right? Are they leaning over? You have to pay attention to the clues that you're getting back, because they could be having an angina attack, right? Which means that they've got a really bad pain in their chest because of the lack of oxygen to the heart muscle, because of the partial blockage. All right? If we have a really bad blockage, or the blockage means that the artery is completely shut, then we're looking at a possible heart attack. Fancy name for a heart attack is myocardial infarction. Right? And that leads to cell death, the other side of the blockage, because those cells are not getting any nutrition and they're not getting any oxygen. So, depending where the blockage is, right, and how quickly that person gets help, will determine how much damage is done to the heart tissue the other side of the blockage. So that can be pretty important, because if I can minimize the extent of the damage, I'm more likely to be able to get that person back to a full working life, right? Two fancy terms that you'll hear: atherosclerosis is a progressive narrowing due to plaque, and we'll have a look at the development of plaque in a second. Arteriosclerosis, so the first one is soft, atherosclerosis is blockage that is getting worse due to plaque deposits. Arteriosclerosis is what happens to the muscles in the artery wall that get stiff and then the artery wall starts to harden with the plaque, and then it can't move. Then there's no more compliance left in the artery wall. Right? So the development of plaque is actually quite complicated. If you're fascinated in it, come to grad school, take Dr. Barlow's Advanced Cardiovascular Exercise Physiology. It's brilliant. All right? So what can happen is that the inside wall of the artery can get damaged for some reason. It might be really high levels of glucose, right? And so we can damage the inside wall. Once it's damaged, it starts to leach these chemicals that then turn into a plaque. And once the plaque is there, it just grabs stuff from the bloodstream, right? If the plaque remains whole and attached to the wall, it's just going to block that artery. But sometimes those plaques detach and become a blood clot and travel around the body, and then we've got all kinds of problems, right? So a thrombus is a blood clot that travels from where it was made. It can cause a heart attack, it can cause a stroke, because the blockage may not be a plaque, the blockage could be the clot, the thrombus, right? So inflammation of this inside wall. I drink a lot of fizzy drinks, don't drink a lot of fizzy drinks, particularly not sodas, right? Very bad for your arteries. coronary artery disease. Group 2 is stroke. And the difference between a heart attack and a stroke is that a heart attack occurs because of a blockage of a coronary artery. A stroke occurs because of a blockage within a vessel in the brain or on the surface of the brain. All right? So strokes are the leading cause of disability in the US. Right? So they cost people a lot of money because your healthcare is very expensive here. They cost you a lot of money because the more money people are charging to their insurance, the more the insurance rates go up on people like you to pay for the people who are sick right now. Right? So it's going to come back and bite us all in the butt. Okay? So a stroke then, because of a blockage, means that the area the other side of the blockage isn't getting glucose, isn't getting oxygen, and we see damage to the brain tissue the other side of the blockage. Now, there's two types. The first type, ischemic strokes, are due to a blockage in the vessels. So in this picture you see that one of the arteries is blocked. Okay. These are the most common form of stroke. About 83–85% of strokes are ischemic strokes. Right? So either because of a thrombus, if the blood clot developed here, it's called thrombosis. If the blood clot traveled from somewhere else in the body, it's called an embolism. The outcome is the same, they just use different terms to identify where the clot was created. Right? So where the clot occurs, and therefore which tissue is damaged, then results in different forms of symptoms. Right? So some people will have a ischemic stroke and they'll have some form of paralysis. My mum had one during the night one time, and I was looking at her at breakfast the next morning. I'm like, something is really wrong, because half of her mouth just stopped working. She was talking now of half. But she didn't have any problems with her arms, right? There was no indication of paralysis except here.
Did she notice it while she was studying?
She didn't initially, and then we pointed it out, and then she's like, oh yeah, it kind of feels funny. You know. So that's an ischemic. The other type of stroke is called hemorrhagic. And a hemorrhagic stroke is slightly different in that instead of there being a blockage in the artery, there's a rupture of a blood vessel. All right? So in this situation, we can have a cerebral hemorrhage. So one of the vessels that lies on the surface of the brain could rupture. Okay? Or it could be what they call a subarachnoid hemorrhage. Oh, sorry, the other way around. Subarachnoid is on the surface, and cerebral is an artery that's kind of inside the brain tissue. Then that blood is released, and there's very little space between your brain and your skull. So there's nowhere for that liquid to go, and it adds pressure to the brain tissue and then does further damage. Plus the other side of the rupture, the tissue isn't getting nutrition or oxygen, so kind of a double whammy. Now, if you're hypertensive, this can lead to an aneurysm, which is a rupture of a vessel. Because if you've got a vessel that has a weak wall and your blood pressure is high, it stresses that weakness, and eventually the weakness gives and ruptures. Or it could be atherosclerotic. You could have plaques forming that are hardening the arteries that then lead to a weak spot. Alright, again, where it occurs is going to change the symptoms that you see occur because of the stroke.